So what I want to do right now is take another look at some of the evidence in this case to see if maybe the defense could argue residual doubt. To do that, I've brought in the best criminal defense investigator. Charles Mittelstadt is with us here in studio. Charles, thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.
First question for you, just as a general, because you know this case very well. You've looked at all the evidence, photos. Where in this case, if anywhere, do you see perhaps some lingering residual potential doubt that a juror may have or the defense could argue? What sort of themes here?
There's two themes that I see, Vinnie. Connectivity is one of the major themes here. The absence of any physical evidence connecting this defendant to the scenes themselves. And what we have here really are three distinct murders that took place. They took place at different times in a different sequence. And so that brings up the second theme, which is the probability of getting away. How do you successfully avoid connecting yourself to each one of these scenes?
And when you say connecting, you mean with physical evidence, DNA, fingerprints,
leaving
blood?
DNA behind, latent prints, fingerprints, any sort of trace evidence, more digital evidence. We know some of the digital evidence puts him not there at the time, but his own statement puts him there at a particular time. But we have this thumb drive, which is one of the more devastating pieces of evidence because he's got to explain what he was doing the entire time, and that's the real challenge in this case.
So let's do this. Let's do this, Charles. I'm going to go through some of this evidence, and as we look at it, tell me if there's any way to look at this evidence in a way that might raise a residual doubt. Again, not reasonable doubt, but residual. Let's start with the shell casings that were found at the scene. There were a bunch of them, but they weren't necessarily connected to the murder weapon.
Correct. So what you generally find, Vinnie, at a scene where you have casings is you're going to find some sort of latent print on there that you try to connect. And then you also try to connect the casing to the projectiles involved in the crime, to a particular weapon. In this case, they did not recover the weapon involved in this case, and those casings don't match any gun found at the scene. So if you recall, they argued that this gun was this Jericho gun that he stole from his buddy Blake. And they also talked about, the ballistics expert for the state talked about the rifling and polygonal rifling, which is something that's unique to the Jericho, but not at the exclusion of the Jericho. There are other manufacturers like CZ, H&K.
Could have been a completely different gun is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Let me show you the gloves, because this was a huge part of the prosecution case. And not just the gloves themselves, but the gloves with his DNA inside and gunshot residue on the outside.
Well, they're his gloves. You would absolutely expect, if his DNA was not inside those gloves, you would find that odd, right? Because they're his gloves. So that the DNA in there in and of itself means nothing. The gunshot residue was problematic in that he doesn't have any way to explain that. In other words, he doesn't have any buddies that are saying, we went to the range and he wears gloves when we go shooting.
The only thing he did say is he said, he didn't say, his lawyer said, obviously he didn't testify, that he had this closet where he kept his gun stuff and he lays them down in there and
that's possible. Transference is a real thing, and it is possible. If there was one reason, and it certainly didn't justify it, but if there was one reason for him to testify, this could have been one reason to say, look, I wore these gloves, I went to the woods on such and such a date, we fired shots in the woods, and I did it by myself or whatever to try to maybe explain the gunshot residue. But the only other explanation would be this transference issue. But that is something that the prosecution pounded away at in closing arguments. They considered this to be one of their bigger pieces of evidence.
Absolutely. All right, let's take a look now at the scene where Margaret was found dead, the office scene. There she is, slumped over. And let's zoom in, because I know there's one piece of evidence here that I found very compelling, and that was her cell phone that is found on the floor, and there's some blood there. Is there anything in this image that could raise a residual doubt for a juror that maybe this doesn't fit the prosecution theory or could be tied to something else happening in that home?
Well, there's some oddities about this. One is this, the absence of any blood spatter there indicates that when at some point this decedent had that phone in her hand. And then the fact that if you were to pick this phone up, we know this from the report, there's actually the blood stain is completely formed underneath that device itself, which indicates that she bled out for some period of time before the phone landed on top of it. Now, whether the phone fell out of her hand, it was in her hand and it fell out, or the phone was actually manipulated by the killer for purposes of looking at what she was doing or erasing some data on the phone. We don't know, but there's certainly something odd about this particular image and what we can infer from it.
Okay, now there's another image here that I thought was very incriminating of the defendant, which is the image of the windows being blocked. What that told me was that whoever was in that house was there a long time, didn't want anyone peeking through the windows. Is there anything about this evidence and this scene that perhaps the defense could talk about as, hey, this is another reason you may have a doubt that it was Grant Amato?
Vinnie, what this tells me, again, certainly the inference of somebody's trying to conceal activities within the house from anybody who may walk up, right? But if you think about what was required to actually make that happen, to rip those pieces of paper, to rip the tape, to place them on there, there's great probability of some sort of transference, latent prints, DNA, maybe hair on the tape. And the argument as far as residual doubt would be like, again, this is another example of the absence of connectivity. How does he do all this? How does this defendant do all of that, and yet there's no connection of him to this particular evidence? Now, whether it was tested or not, I don't know, but that's certainly something that that would have been a smoking gun right there.
All right, let's take a look at another scene now. You said 3 scenes. This is Cody Amato on the ground, door open. There he is. Anything that you see in this particular scene that, again, might raise some sort of residual doubt?
Yes, the fact that unquestionably he was moved. The way we know this is because we know from the reporting that the door was closed. When law enforcement showed up, that door was actually closed. But in order to achieve that shot, Vinnie, the door would have had to have been open. We know that based upon the trajectory of the shot.
I think we can take a closer look at that right now. Let's zoom in and we can, I think, yeah, there it is.
So you see the projectile entered the sheetrock, and so that shot could have only been achieved with the door open. Then I don't know if we have another shot, a wider shot of the decedent.
We can pull out from the garage. I think it's the next.
Yeah.
Here we go.
So we know to the left of that door jamb is where the majority of the blood was pooled, which would indicate, based upon the location of his injury to the head, that.
And that's towards his feet now, right?
That's towards his feet now.
So you're saying his head would have been where his feet are?
At some point, his head is where his feet were. In all likelihood, he was in the middle of the doorway there. And so, there we go, right there. His head was located right there at some point. In order for the killer to close that door, he would have had to push this victim inside of the doorway. Again, that contact is what would have, could have, and should have created some sort of potential evidence there in the form of DNA, in the form of some sort of trace evidence.
So again, getting back to that concept of connectivity, is that there's no evidence of Grant Amato on Cody Amato, but he had to move him, so you would expect to find that type of evidence.
Precisely. You have these 2 scenes that we've seen so far, mom and brother, where we can see that there's been some form of interaction, some form of manipulation by the killer, by the assailant, and yet there's no connectivity.
Have you ever seen a scene, in all your years, have you ever seen a scene like this, where 3 separate in one home, yet there's none of this physical evidence, the DNA, the fingerprints, the blood, the shoe prints, any of that connecting the defendant?
No, I haven't. And the one thing that we have to remember is that this defendant lived there, right? So there's a certain amount of his DNA, of his prints, of his presence that we would expect. But on the objects, on the victims themselves, the things where you would expect for him to, there isn't. And that's part of this counter argument. On the one hand, the prosecution is making this argument that he's this obsessed, crazed guy who's fleeced his family out of $200,000 because of this woman, this Sylvie. But on the other hand, in order to perpetrate this and get away with it without connectivity like this, and when I say get away with it, be successful and not having
leave anything behind.
Right. That's amazing.
Okay, so what we're going to do, Charles is going to stay here. We got a little more to do. Again, folks, we're not talking about reasonable doubt here. We're talking about residual doubt, something that the defense could argue, hey, jurors, one of you may not be convinced beyond any and all doubt. You may still think maybe, just maybe, someone else could have done it. And attorneys have successfully argued that as a reason for someone to get life rather than death. Up next, was any evidence left on the gun holstered on Chad Amato's hip? That's coming up inside our evidence room. Next. All right, the jury has already found Grant Amato guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of murder. But as we move towards the penalty phase on August 12th, one thing that the defense can do and can argue, and I've seen it done before, is argue lingering or residual doubt in the case. Is there some piece of doubt that's less than reasonable doubt that the jurors may still have in this case, that they're not convinced 100% that Grant Amato did it or that prosecutors proved it 100%. So I've got defense investigator Charles MIttelstadt with us here inside the evidence room as we take another look at some of the evidence to see if there's any opportunity for residual doubt. And right now I want to go through an important piece of evidence in the case, which was Chad Amato, the father's phone, and some of the history on that phone, and to see if anything that happened there, like at 5:25, it records 67 steps taken. Prosecutors argued those were his last 67 steps from the garage into the kitchen. The fact that that's on there does anything. If not, you can just pass to the next one.
Unfortunately, it's hard for me to really sort of extract any sort of favorable residual doubt from this. I mean, what this does is just help bolster the timeline, and Grant Amato puts himself in that house the entire day. So he should have some explanation for what was going on at that time, and well, we never heard from him, but we also know there wouldn't have been any sort of plausible explanation for 3 murders being committed while he's in the home without him having some knowledge of it. So there's not much that I can pull from that.
Let's go next. Let's go to the next one then. All right, so 5:25 to 5:52, there's no activity on the phone. And prosecutors are saying there's no activity because there's no activity. He is shot and killed.
Again, this is mostly favorable to the prosecution, and it helps timestamp their timeline in terms of, based on their theory, in the sequence, they believe mom was killed first, dad comes home, he's killed, and then the brother is lured to the house.
Through the phone.
Through this phone, and then he is killed. So this is the more damaging information in the case. These are not good facts.
Let's go to the next one, see if there's anything on there, anything. Next. 6:45 is that text to Cody that you were just talking about, and is there a way to make an argument that maybe he could have made it? That he could have made that as some residual doubt to play along with the defense timeline to an extent that maybe it could have happened that way?
I don't think so, Vinnie. The text.
He's honest, folks.
Yeah, now
That's
listen.
one thing.
I mean,
Charles
we've
is
got to
honest.
be objective.
Yep.
I mean, I'm a fact finder, but this is what led to the testimony from the girlfriend, right? Because she's the one that witnesses a text come in, and then she thought a phone call had taken place that had been I believe.
That came, she thought that Cody got a call from her father initially, but then
that Cody initiated, then it was
no.
actually the opposite. But the phone records don't lie, and so you can see the interactions, and that's why, and we've had this conversation many times before, Vinnie, this is the biggest snitch in most of our cases, whether it's a drug conspiracy case or a murder case or any sort of violent crime. Everybody's life is in this phone, and it's sort of irrefutable. There's different things that you can infer from the data. It's not doesn't tell the entire story, but this is not helpful.
It tells an important story.
Absolutely.
Let's go forward again on it. Incoming call from Cody. Text received, missed call from Cody, and a missed call from Cody. That's bad. Let's just go to the next one. That's not going to help the defense at all.
Yeah, it won't be arguing
that. And
that.
then 12:08 a.m., this is the USAA banking app that's accessed with a fingerprint for about 12 minutes. Is there any residual doubt that a dead person's fingerprint can access this? I mean, the defense was arguing that everyone uses their thumb. No one's going to, and there would be blood on there. Is that an argument?
Well, that would be the argument, I think, is, again, the absence of that sort of connectivity to, if that is the theory, then that means that the defendant would have handled that phone and there should be some of his DNA on that phone, and yet there is none of his DNA on that phone. So it's not so much the call, it's just
the phone itself.
The inference that in order for him to do that, he would have had to come in contact with the phone.
All right, let's go to the third murder scene now. This is the father, Chad Amato, and all the blood that is found in the scene. From all this blood in this kitchen and a body that appears to be moving to a certain extent, what is the residual doubt that could be argued relative to this type of evidence?
Well, this is probably the one where there's the greatest amount of residual doubt, I think, that can be argued. And that is that, again, this is a tremendously bloody scene, Vinny. And there's so much interaction here, and I know we have some other photographs that we'll get more specific on, but it's clear that the killer had a lot of interaction with this victim in this blood. So you would expect shoe prints, you would expect maybe latent prints, you would expect DNA from handling the body. So there's a lot there that there were so many opportunities for Grant Amato's connectivity to occur here, and it just doesn't.
And they even searched his car, and in his car they found no blood either.
Absolutely.
And we know he was in his car that night. So let's take a look at the next photo, and this is the one of the pants of Chad Amato. And all of us, when we looked at this, looked at seemingly fingerprints or some sort of handprints on those pants.
And this is, I think, one of the more significant ones. So getting back to the gloves for a moment, if the prosecution's theory is that Grant Amato was wearing these gloves when he committed these heinous murders and fired the shots that resulted in the gunshot residue, then these would have been the same gloves that he would have been handling his father with. And we can tell from the imprints on the pants that that's not, these handprints are not from the father. This is from whoever the killer is. And the absence of any sort of DNA, any sort of trace evidence can be as a result of gloves being worn. But then you would expect that he would have disposed of the gloves, but he didn't dispose of the gloves if they're the same gloves that the prosecution is contending. It's very, very difficult to get blood residue off of particularly
that was one of the
materials.
questions that the jury had for the expert, talking about washing those gloves.
Absolutely.
And what could or could not come out of those gloves.
The probability that he gets rid of the gun, keeps the gloves, he wipes the gloves off sufficient to where he gets rid of any blood, but not the gunshot residue. That is probably one of the stronger arguments that you have in this case. The prosecution has to argue, well, he changed gloves to handle the body, but that doesn't seem conceivable.
Now you've got another mystery pair of gloves, but we have these gloves which obviously have no blood in them, and the jury was asked.
Look how porous. You see all the little wrinkles in there, Vinny, and all you have the seams. There's so many different opportunities for blood to get lodged in there, and you could never clean blood off of these gloves. I've been in scenes before where there's been violent crimes committed, and they literally bleached the entire scene trying to clean it up. And later law enforcement came in with luminol and they found tons of blood. It is very, very difficult. You'd have to be an expert, a crime scene expert, to even understand where you would start. Somebody like Grant Amato would have no knowledge to even begin to be effective at that.
Let's take a look at Chad Amato again, and the gun holster, which again, prosecutors argued was staged after the killings and was placed on him. Any sort of opportunity for, not reasonable doubt, folks. Again, this is residual doubt, something much less.
This actually completely points away from Grant Amato. And the reason I say that, Vinny, is because we now know that the father was actually right-handed. And if you look at that style of holster and that sort of placement, that's designed for somebody who wants to reach over in order to unholster their weapon. He couldn't have done that. He's right-handed. He would have been trying to do this. So whoever placed that weapon on him, we know that that wasn't on him at the time he was killed because there's actually blood behind it, okay? Whoever did that, the inference that I'd be making as far as residual doubt is, it couldn't have been Grant because he knows his father's not right-handed. Why would he do that? Why would he be so meticulous in all these other ways, but in that particular one be so careless? That one probably is one of the bigger pieces of residual doubt right there.
All right, now I want you to take a listen to some of the evidence that was found inside the home involving marijuana.
Did you testify earlier that this would be used for growing marijuana?
Yes, I did.
How can you tell?
I could tell because there is a light source here There is an exhaust fan here. The inside is totally taped up with aluminum foil.
What is this a photograph of?
That is a photograph of 3 mason jars and a metal tin on top of a gun safe in Chad's closet.
Okay. And what did you suspect was in these mason jars?
I believe there was suspected marijuana in the mason jars.
Okay.
So is there anything about the fact that this marijuana growing equipment was found and the paraphernalia and the mason jars with marijuana in it somehow could be used to argue that someone else could have been responsible for this?
Absolutely, and they actually tried to do that based upon the fact that there's illegal activity going on in the home, and that who knows who they may have been interacting, who are they buying their seeds from, who are they maybe selling this marijuana to. But there's one other fact that I think is even more important, and that's the testimony of, I think, the first responding officer who actually jimmied the lock to get in the house and had to move that armoire that contains all that to the side in the kitchen. And this goes to the issue of the fact that there was no forced entry, and that was a big issue that the prosecution argued. There's no forced entry. But yet, law enforcement demonstrated that that house was not very hard to get into. So it really sort of undermines that argument, and I think that may be the second aspect of that piece of evidence that you can argue.
Charles Mittelstadt, defense investigator, appreciate your time tonight. Thanks so much.